It's my pleasure to introduce Commissioner Robert J. Jackson, Jr., who was sworn in on January 11th, 2018, and brings to the SEC experience as a legal scholar, policy professional, and corporate lawyer. Commissioner Jackson's academic work has focused on corporate governance and of particular interest to this session, the use of advanced data science, techniques to improve transparency in securities markets. Commissioner Jackson holds degrees from the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard. He was born in the Bronx, New York, and is a lifelong Yankees fan. Thank you, Commissioner Jackson, for supporting this workshop today.
Well, thank you so much. And I want to begin by thanking my colleagues, the folks at Commerce, and all of you for being here this morning. I've been looking forward to this for weeks. It's such an important day to have some hard conversations about what it's like to be in the position of a first-generation professional trying to build a career. And I thought I would just start off today trying to give you a sense of why this is so important to me. I myself don't, as my colleagues explained, I'm originally from the Bronx. I come from, my mother is one of 9 kids. My father's one of 5. I come from a big Irish Catholic family. And though I don't identify as a first-generation professional, my parents were. And for me, the experience of growing up as a child with first-generation professionals was extremely unique. My mother was a teacher. My father started off as a stock clerk, an inventory clerk by the hour at an encyclopedia company called Funk and Wagnalls. Anybody remember that? Yeah, me too. That was the encyclopedia where if you paid $1 at the supermarket at checkout, you could build your own encyclopedia set. Yeah, that put me through college. And the experience of being raised by 2 members of the FGP community was, for me, instructive because they didn't know much about what I should do, except that I should get an education. That's all I heard from the time I was a kid. You're going to college. We don't know where, we don't know how, but you're going to college. And for me, that was a very important step because it was made clear to me that I should prioritize that. But I have to tell you, the experience for me was I arrived at that college, 18 years old, with no idea what to do next. I mean, I knew go to class, like study. But I would notice from the very beginning that people were building these communities, these places to go hang out, and I didn't understand what they were doing. And what they were doing, of course, and we're going to talk about this at length, what they were doing was building a network. What they were doing was building a set of relationships. Because they knew from the day they showed up at that campus that these were going to be successful people who they were going to be able to want to call some future time. But that's not how I thought about it. As a matter of fact, I got a lecture from my father the day he dropped me off at school. He said, this is like a job. You go at 9, come home at 5. And, I had no problem treating it like that. But the idea that you were building some network for your future never even occurred to me. Never occurred to me. I did my homework and went to sleep. Meanwhile, my friends were building a Rolodex that I'm sure, continue to draw on to this day. So I'm hoping that my colleagues on the panel here will be able to join me in having a conversation about not arriving necessarily understanding that and going through the process of learning how to thrive professionally in an environment where those relationships are the key, where being able to make that phone call, have that conversation are crucial to building the kind of career that you want to have. So as a panel, we're going to have a broad conversation about that, and we've got incredible panelists, my colleagues here at the SEC, many of whom identify as first-generation professionals. I think they're going to share a bit of their own stories. But we're going to begin with our colleague and friend Maurice Champagne, who is going to share the state-of-the-art scholarship on that subject and give a sense not only for his own experience, but what study in this area can tell us. I'm going to briefly introduce Dr. Champagne. Maurice Champagne is a senior data analyst supporting the Office of Equal Employment Opportunities and its affirmative employment program. He holds a PhD in public policy from George Mason University with a focus on quantitative methods and a specialization in social network analysis. And Dr. Champagne is going to share with us some of the lessons we can learn from social science in this area about how to go about building the network that is so important to being a successful first-generation professional. Dr. Champagne.
Thank you. There are human social tendencies that influence one's career success that are somewhat different from performance metrics. Often, this somewhat opaque area has to do with social networks. 70 to 80% of jobs are secured through networks, and even after people leave a job, they go back to the network for their next job. So the network is determining the opportunities available to you throughout the life of your career. The professional network is the entity that translates your performance into career success. Successful professionals are always thinking about what their network looks like and how to navigate it. In social network analysis, we map these relationships and use the scientific method to find out how networks work. The pattern of relationships in any network produces different types of terrain. Some networks, like celebrity networks, follow this pattern where every new relationship is disproportionately more likely to go to one of a few people. So these people are getting more and more influential as time goes on. The internet and many biological systems also have this terrain. We call that a scale-free network. Some networks have a terrain characterized by many cells of people communicating in a compartmentalized way, but no central player communicating across all the cells. Clandestine networks, especially terrorist networks, have this terrain. We call that a cellular network. We also see small world networks, in which most people are only connected to people in their local neighborhoods. But a couple of people have long-range ties that are unbounded by distance. And everybody thinks it's a small world because they all know this handful of people. But the fundamental network structure to understand from a career success standpoint is the core periphery network. Core periphery networks are characterized by a pattern of two sets of actors. A set of actors with a high density of relationships between themselves, located here, and a set of actors with low density of relationships between themselves, out here. You know you have one when you observe a core of interconnected people and a periphery of people who each has a single connection to the core. Core periphery networks are important to understand because they're the most efficient terrain for getting work done in a way that utilizes everyone's different skill sets. This makes the core periphery network the most prevalent structure in organizations. And the consequence of this is that anyone who wants to become influential in their professional network has to go through the core. And what most frequently separates high performers who achieve career success from high performers who have difficulty climbing the ladder is that their talent was recognized by the core. And the ultimate goal of everything you do from a networking perspective is to have your talent recognized by the core. Who's in the core is going to be correlated with, but not the same, as people's formal positions in a hierarchy. There could be people without titles that the leadership is relying on for expertise. There could be people with more extensive communication links than others. These people are also in the core. And sometimes they're more accessible or more influential than the people in the formal leadership. You also have professional networks that cross organizations, so there is no formal hierarchy. These networks still have a core and a periphery. Getting the core to recognize you is not about just knowing a lot of people. It's about getting your whole network to associate you with certain talents and ideas. And if you're networking well, that message eventually makes its way to the core. Forget the phrase, it's not what you know, it's who you know. Remember, it's who you know and what you know, or what are you known for knowing. Professional networks operate on the boundary of interpersonal connections and expertise. People need to know who can do what effectively when there's a need or they find out about an opportunity. So the goal here is not just to get people to like you. It's about imprinting your main skill on your network's mind. It's important to practice explaining your skills to different audiences. Find out what resonates with different types of people and use that. If I'm networking with people in social network analysis, I might say I can do a quadratic assignment procedures test on a correlated topic model. But if I'm networking with people outside my discipline, it's more effective to just say, I do that cool analysis Mark Zuckerberg used to build Facebook. And you can passively network by being always ready to take on an assignment that can get you exposure in your area of expertise. Most work is not independent, it's collaborative. And scientists have made findings about collaborative work that are counterintuitive. In collaborative activities, you need to become known as the expert if you are the expert. Network science has a line of research showing how collaboration improves performance, but it's challenging for the network to see what you're doing. If you haven't built up a reputation yet, it takes more to get people to associate you with that project. So when the Corps is trying to determine who did the outstanding work, they have a hard time figuring out who done it. One way to get connected is to establish reciprocity. In network science, reciprocal links indicate a relationship. But one-way links can create scenarios in which two people disagree about whether there is a relationship. Networking with an eye toward how you can help your counterpart creates a bank in which it's more fluid to ask them for something in the future. You're setting off the reciprocity. Last point about network structure. Crackert found that when you're performing your job, there's always a network of people you're relying on for expertise, called the advice network, and a network of people you trust, whom you have strong interpersonal relationships with, called the trust network. It's important to cultivate both. And one challenge people run into is when the same people who make up your trust network are the same people you're relying on as your advice network. Sometimes, people whom you have less of a comfort level with can help you with a specific problem more effectively than the people in your trust network. They are instrumental connections, and they're just as important as interpersonal connections. Relying on your interpersonal connections for everything can be inefficient. Some simple observations. Dunbar's research shows the cognitive demand on maintaining relationships is high. It's taxing on the neocortex. He took the brains of different animal species and showed that the number of relationships any animal can take on forms a straight line against the ratio of the size of the neocortex compared to the size of the whole brain. Networking is serious brain work. If you know you're going into an environment where networking occurs, it's important to make sure you get enough sleep. Eat something if you have to, so your mind isn't focused on your physiological needs when you have to network. And if you've researched the person before you've met them, it can be easier on the mind to connect in a natural way when you're in the moment. Last point. Shoot for the Grey Cardinals. These are people who don't seem to be central, but the central players are relying on them for advice. They're often more accessible and can produce the same result. Everybody wants a couple of minutes with the leader, and if you get it, it's often vacuous. But the Grey Cardinal has time for lunch or to look at your project, and the leader is likely to do what the Grey Cardinal suggests anyway. Google's algorithm is good at finding these, but you can see them if you pay enough attention. In this example, everybody is reporting directly or indirectly to node B. But there's this one node, node C, that's the only one that has a two-way relationship with node B. Maybe they're relying on each other for advice. Maybe they're bouncing ideas off of each other. Or node B is going to node C to solicit his opinion before he does anything. One reason Google's algorithm is better than any search engine that came before it is because it's excellent at finding these types of nodes. They're just applying it to web pages rather than people, but you can apply them to people. Commissioner Jackson, I have these tips, and I can leave them up here, and we can incorporate them into the Q&A if you'd like.
That'd be great. Let's do that.
Great.
Thank you, Dr. Champagne. And I have found the discussion of the literature and the science in this area extremely interesting. But for me, what's more instructive is the experience of actual friends and colleagues who went out and tried to build a career as a first-generation professional. And so I'm delighted to be moderating this conversation with my colleagues here at the SEC who have lived that experience. So what I'd like to do is have a conversation among the panel, reflecting some of the themes Dr. Champagne has identified, and then we can have a broader conversation. So let me start with Gabe Benacasa. Gabe, welcome. Thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you very much.
And before you get started, I'm just going to point out.
My mic.
Do you have a mic, Gabe?
Yeah, mic.
There you go. So, Gabe, the one thing I want to tell our friends about you, and then I want you to share your experience. Gabe is the first chief risk officer of the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Still don't know what that is.
And so not only is he
What it means is if something bad happens,
it's his fault.
it's his fault.
Nah, man, that's my job. What's so important about what Gabe's going to share with us is not only is he going to share his experience as an FGP, but what it's like to be the first person in a job. Because he is in a real way on a day-to-day basis defining what it means to be the chief risk officer. Now, Gabe, you're a first-generation professional. Tell us about your journey, man.
So I was born in there. That's a farm in Italy. My uncle just turned 80, still lives there. And my mom was 23, had 3 little kids, 5, 3, and 1, and Dad died. So go to the next. So this is when I moved here. Our tractor was a horse. This was the biggest truck I had ever seen till I was 6. I go from here to New York City. Picture flying in a plane, getting out of JFK Airport. I've seen maybe 20 people in my entire life. All of them were related to me. All of them were called Benacasa, and so I thought my name was like very common. I land in JFK, and my mother had a 5th grade education. My dad had a 5th grade education. I was going to be a watermelon farmer. That was what I was going to do in life. My mom was incredibly religious. When I asked Mom for advice, she says to say a prayer. I want to get into network. My real network started, my uncle, when I got here, was 13. We didn't know anything about school, but my uncle made us do all of our lessons. There were 10 of us living in a 2-bedroom house, apartment, I mean. My kids can't get used to it. They didn't grow up that way. So what happened was, I had the terms of what I could aspire to was, I had an uncle who was a bus driver. My mother was a seamstress, worked in what's called piecework. My grandfather worked in a machine shop. So I saw that element. I also saw probably the most profitable element in my growing up was criminals. My best friend, second best friend, has spent most of his life in jail. Now, it was more lucrative than being a seamstress, getting paid by the piece. I started working at age 14. I learned what child labor is. For 45 hours of work, I got paid $1 an hour when the minimum wage was $2.15. So I went to pretty rough public high school. I actually didn't take the SATs. I went to Baruch College. Let me go back a little bit. I was always good in math. So I said, what could I do with math? I'll become a CPA. I didn't know any CPAs. I actually didn't know what a CPA did. But I became a CPA. I also did tax work on the side and worked in restaurants. One of my breaks, and I kind of started getting into understanding a new world, was I was hired as a messenger for a law firm called Milbank Tweed, Hadley and McCloy. I learned what was called a white shoe law firm. I had no idea what that was. None of them wore white shoes. All of them had wingtips. So what happened was I was going to college to become a CPA. I continued down that path, but I met a young associate. His name was Sam. And Sam sat me down one time and explained to me law. But one thing stuck out in my mind. The starting salary for a lawyer was 4 times the starting salary of a CPA. So I had in the back of my mind, I could be a lawyer, but I still didn't know what that meant. So then what happened was I met my wife. We were 19. I got married and became a CPA. And then I told her, listen, I want to go to law school. And she was like, what? So I went to law school at nights. And kind of from that point, career changed a bit. And I got hired by a law firm, another white shoe law firm called Davis, Polk, and Wardwell. And things started to change. You know, I actually, someone just coined the word class or social class transition. Well, I faced that in spades. I remember at first being somewhat embarrassed. People were talking about what their parents did. My mother was a piece worker, a seamstress. So life changed. But in terms of going a little bit to networking, one of the things I'm kind of not into all the scientific stuff. One of the things I find is try and give someone an opportunity that maybe looks different than you or whatever, or just look. So I looked at a resume. I had to hire someone. He had done all kinds of jobs. He was this big guy, sloppy as anything. Came into the interview, his shirt tail was out. I became his mentor, and he was one of the best hires I've ever had.
There's a lot of lessons we could draw from that experience. What I'd like to do is go around and hear from each of the panelists about their experience, and then we can open it up if that's all right. So I'm going to turn to our colleague on your right there. Rick Fleming, an extraordinary colleague, someone I've worked with very closely. Like Gabe, he's the first of something. He is the first investor advocate at the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission. And so, like Gabe, not only does he have to deal with all the transitions that Gabe was talking with, and we're going to hear about his story, but also every day he's defining what it means to be an investor advocate at the SEC, because no one's ever done that before. So, Rick, tell us about your journey.
Well, thank you, and thanks to all of you for being here. It's tough to follow Gabe's story. So, I also grew up in a rural area, but not the same as Gabe. I grew up in a little tiny town in Kansas called Leroy, population 600. And I think of myself as being the rural poor, which means you're poor, but you don't really know it because everybody around you is poor, except for a few farmers that drew, some years would get nice new vehicles, and the farmers' daughters had better stuff than the rest of us. But for the most part, I didn't really realize I was poor until much later. But basically, in my family, one of the things that happened to us when I was 10 years old, our house burned to the ground. And shortly after that, my dad took off. So that left my mom to raise 4 kids on what she was making as the school secretary. And it wasn't a salaried position, so in the summers, she'd have to take a job as a waitress at the truck stop, just to sort of keep things together. So what that meant for me was, if I wanted the Nike shoes or the Levi's 501s, I was going to be working for it. And so I also started working at a really early age. In fact, age 10, don't tell the labor officials, but a real job with, shifts at age 10. And I just had a whole series of just jobs as a young person. And so one of the jobs I had was one summer I spent cleaning the oil tanks. So if you know anything about sort of the oil production, there's the well that, goes like this, that pumps the oil out of the ground, and then it sends it to a tank battery until a truck comes along and takes it to a pipeline. At least in Kansas, that's how it works. And from time to time, these tanks overflow, and so you get crude oil all down the side of the tank, and there's other maintenance you have to do. So that was my job one summer, out in the hot sun with a bucket of kerosene, which was the cleaning agent you use to clean off crude oil from the side of a tank. And weed whipping. Anybody know what a weed whip is? Not the kind that, spins, but the kind that you do this, doing that, and taking a wire brush to the oil pumps to scrape the rust off and repaint them, doing stuff like that out in the hot sun. And of course I have this complexion that doesn't really tolerate a lot of direct sun, and so that was really the point for me where I said, nah, college really sounds like a pretty good alternative. Because I'm looking around at people, guys in my town, the parents of my friends, that's the kind of jobs they were doing as adults. So I go to college and, I'm fortunate, and I don't know anything. I remember taking the PSAT. I didn't know what it was. They just herd us into a room and we take this test. And I'm just, dinking around and I don't even finish the thing. And then the scores come back and I figure out it's like this competition and I should have been putting effort into it. And so the next year, ACT comes around, and by then I'd figured it out. Oh, this is important. So I did much better on the ACT than the PSAT. But anyway, I go to college. I went to college at Washburn University, which is a small, little-known school in Topeka, Kansas. But coming from that small town, I felt like I was going to the city. Now, it wasn't New York like you, but I remember walking across the campus the first day I'm there, and it strikes me that I do not know one living soul on this entire campus or in this entire city. I'd probably gone to Topeka maybe 3 times my whole life. And so you talk about no network. It was striking to me that it's on me if I'm going to be successful here. And a couple other things that were striking was that, walking, when you meet somebody on the sidewalk, you didn't say hello. That was weird, coming from a small town. Or driving down the street, you didn't wave to everybody that you passed, or at least give them the farmer's wave. So, that kind of thing. So that's sort of where I came from, and it was a long story, sort of the steps between there and here, but we'll talk about some of that.
Thanks, Rick. Hearing you guys share your story, for me, one thing that you hear consistently, you probably sense it in what our colleagues have said, is that at that moment, when you arrive at that place, whether it's New York or Topeka, it's overwhelming, man.
It is.
It's scary. I mean, I remember feeling that way. And one thing I want everybody in the room to think about, we're going to turn to our colleague Yolanda in a moment, is how we can transform that moment of overwhelming into a different way of feeling, a different way of experiencing it. And the way that we've talked about it sometimes is taking that moment of pain, of fear, and turning into a moment of realizing it's a privilege, it's an opportunity. I'm here at college, I'm here in New York. I have this opportunity. Maybe you've heard a little bit from my colleagues about your background, you feel different. You feel maybe even a little shame about that. I'm not from here.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
My first thought, I had never seen a fence in my life. Our house was in Queens. I go to outside, I see concrete. I had never seen concrete before. And all I think of is, I want to go back to Kansas.
Exactly. So one thing to think about as you hear from our colleagues is turn that moment of pain into a moment of privilege. Turn some shame, that you feel about, I'm not sure I belong here. Turn that into pride. I am here. And that moment of discomfort where you're not sure if you're supposed to wave to everybody, where you're not sure if you can ask that law firm guy, it's awkward. We never met. And I'm trying to turn that moment of discomfort into determination. Pain into privilege, shame into pride, discomfort into determination is something I hope we'll be able to talk more about. In the meantime, my colleague to my left, Yolanda Lavery, You're an attorney advisor in the Division of Enforcement?
Yeah, I've been here for 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Incredible. Thank you for such a privilege to work with folks like you. Tell us about your journey as a first-generation professional.
So my journey started off with a couple of Cuban immigrant parents who came over in the 50s. Nobody spoke English. I was actually listening to Gabe's story, and it was very similar. Piece worker, zippers for 10 cents a piece. Dad, was a baker and then eventually worked for the phone company. That was his big aspirational job. And as I was growing up, education, was the thing in our house. I remember once I wasn't feeling well, and if you didn't feel well, you still went to school. Well, I had my tonsils out the next day because I really wasn't feeling well. So you went to school, and when it came time to pick a college, there was a college, a couple blocks down the street, and that's where you went. You went to that college, and I started to think of, how I made some of these choices that we make in degrees. I wanted to be an English major, and my mom, in her broken English, says, English. Why would you need to be an English major? So I became an accounting major. And that she could understand. You can do our taxes for us. And then as you are starting in your path, how did I decide, the career path of a lawyer, interacting with lawyers? Because when you're a first generation and you're the only one who speaks English, you go to court with people a lot. And you get handed, pleadings and, Jose's getting a divorce. Can you take a look at that? So I started interacting informally with this network of lawyers, and I said, I think I can do that. And so I went to law school in the evenings and worked during the day. So I didn't have a lot of opportunities to build networks while I was coming up the ranks. And so I'd love that this topic, is something we're talking about now, because it's making me feel like, LinkedIn didn't exist back then when we were growing up, and so now people have more opportunities, but it's good to be having this conversation now and understand that we're kind of all started from the same place.
I think it's so important, Yolanda, and it's great to hear about your story. I'm now going to turn to another colleague, Hema Lomax, a senior counsel in the Division of Enforcement. Please share with us your journey as a first-generation professional.
Thank you, Commissioner Jackson, and thank you to all of you for being here. So we've talked a little bit about our parents, and I'm going to start with my parents too. I think as a first-generation professional, I sometimes find myself talking about what they didn't give me, and then struggle because I want to talk about how grateful I am as well. Of course, there's that duality of it. So my mother was born in Uganda. She's Indian, but was born in Uganda and went to the UK when she was 19. My father was born in Guyana. The stories I grew up with were as follows. I came here with £5 in my pocket, nothing else. My father would tell me that he didn't have any shoes. And so these points of pride, these points of struggle, these points of discomfort that my parents shared with me were always stories for me of, as Commissioner Jackson said, privilege. My goodness, look what you've achieved, having only had £5 in your pocket. A real point of pride that he said he didn't have shoes when he was younger, but look, he can have anything he wants now because he's worked for it. And with those attitudes in mind, I certainly was grateful to have the belief I could do anything, because if they could do that, what was my excuse? And so then let's fast forward to me. When I was about 16, I decided I'd come here as an exchange student. I knew my parents would support me because they travelled across oceans themselves, and they saw how that had helped them, that struggle, that pain. They didn't know how to help me with that except just to say, yes, you can do it. And I went to a business law class at school, and someone said, can you write a letter for homework tonight, a mock letter of your ideal job? I was 16, I had no clue what I wanted to do. I'd grown up watching Crown Court on TV. It's a bit like LA Law, I don't know, one of those things. I kind of thought I'd want to be a lawyer, but I decided I'd like to be Secretary General of the UN. I mean, why not? So I looked up the resumes. Don't ask me how, because there was no internet. But I found the resumes of the prior 7 Secretary Generals of the UN, and I decided, that's what I'll do. Lawyer, academics, PhD. So then let me fast forward again. I'm finishing my undergraduate degree. I'm trying to get a job. I'm struggling. I had a few messages from my parents, things like, you're a woman, you're going to have to work twice as hard. You're a minority, you're going to have to work 4 times as hard. Things like, don't borrow money, maybe for a house, but nothing else. And work, you must pay your way. So I had 5 jobs while I was at law school. They all paid between £2 and £4 an hour. I think the £4 was exceptional. I had a senior job there. And I had to buy, at the end of all that, this very uncomfortable wig. I'm a trial attorney in the UK. This costs $800, at least it did 17 years ago. $800, which I didn't have. But let me tell you how I turned those points of pain into privilege. So one of the jobs that I took on was, so my mum she's a nurse. She worked day and night. She tried to train in the day, but at the nighttime she wanted to pay for things, so she worked at night as well. And I kid you not, I don't know when she slept, but she worked day and night. She also worked the holidays, and so I wanted to spend the holidays with her. And she worked in a nursing home. So I would volunteer to work with her for Christmas and Easter. And the patients there remembered me. I was friendly, I was nice, I was young. One such patient would tell her son about that nice girl that comes in on the holidays. And it turns out that that son of hers asked my mum about me. She said, who's this girl my mum keeps talking about, this gentleman said. And my mum, I'd equipped her with something. I told her what I'd wanted to be. I wanted to be a lawyer. It's all she knew. She didn't know how to help me, and she knew that. She knew what she didn't know. And so she just decided to brag about me, point of pride. Oh, my daughter's a lawyer. She's going to be a lawyer. She's studying at law school. And of course, the gentleman she was speaking to was a partner at a law firm. And I had applied to probably 120 law firms in the 3 years that I had been in law school. But that was how I got my first offer at a law firm. That gentleman, having seen the work I did in place, and I'm going to talk later, hopefully, about networking in place. Networking's a dirty word. Oh, I don't know how you feel about it. I don't like networking. I want to talk to you about net building. Building your network where you are is doable. Do it when you don't need it, because you never quite know. Another story like that. So I told you about the UN. I mentioned that for a reason. My father moved to New York when I was in college, and I thought, you know what? The UN's in New York. My father wanted to be a priest. He has no legal background, but I thought he would meet a lot of people if he became a priest. So I sent probably the worst cover letter and resume I'd ever written to my dad. I said, put this in your pocket, and even if you meet a cleaner, please tell them I want to work at the UN. And lo and behold, he talked about it. I equipped my father to talk about his daughter that wants to be Secretary General of the UN. It's a good story. You need a story, right? And he did. He found somebody whose daughter was doing college credit, and he offered to take my resume to the ambassador of Guyana, who happens to be at the UN, and that was my first professional job. I share these stories with you to talk about, and hopefully we'll get to it. Networking in place, building a web, neighbours. You don't have to go to a happy hour to have these opportunities if you're doing you well where you are.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And we have just a little bit of time for some questions. I'm just going to pose it to the entire panel. But this is one that we put together a list of questions, and the one that jumped off the page to be felt like something was on my mind. Sometimes people feel, and a couple of you have mentioned, that the idea of networking, it's inauthentic, it's fake. Like you don't really know this person. And it sort of feels like you don't even belong there. And so one thing I wanted to ask about is, how do you maintain your authenticity? How do you stay who you are, but still have that conversation, talk to that person, meet that person? That was always hard for me, and I'm wondering, given your experiences, how did you guys get over that? How did you deal with that moment where it feels like, look, this feels like a fake conversation, but it's one that I want to have, one that I need to have? How did you guys grapple with that?
If I may, Rob. So we talked about discomfort. I mean, this is a very uncomfortable thing to wear. I like to as a symbol. You have to be comfortable with discomfort, but that's easy to say and hard to achieve, isn't it? So one thing we've learned from Tanisha is that we all have stories. I know we've got too many stories to tell. We've got not enough time, but I know that all of you have got your own stories, and you need to think about how you can turn that story into a conversation piece. This sits in my office here at work, because when people come in, sometimes they ask me about it, and it gives me a chance to have a genuine conversation. Most networking isn't about what you want, it's about who you are. By telling you I've got a barrister's wig, you'll learn that I'm a trial attorney. I won't talk about being a trial attorney or any cases. I'll just tell you that I am one. So I think one piece of advice is own who you are. Those stories that are percolating up in you today, try and find a way to pitch it. We'll talk about that later on today, because conversation starters are all you need.
When I first started, to be quite honest, I was embarrassed about my background. And then I realized at some point, and I started getting gray hair by that point, that actually I shouldn't be embarrassed anymore. And I went from embarrassed to proud. And I tell people my story. It's one of those things where originally I hit a transition where I said, wow. I went to law school at night. I did all these things. And by the way, In 2009, what I was expert in was a lawyer for proprietary trading for broker-dealers and banks. That business is no longer around. I got laid off. And so the career went from here to down there. And actually, you know, what I found was also interesting. By that time, I'd started developing an incredible network. And what I found was that in times of stress, you find out who your real friends are. And that's when I had people who helped me who I hadn't spoken to in 10 years. And it was incredibly helpful to call people, and they returned my call. And that's why I'm a huge believer in, you know, making friends with people and also giving others opportunities that may not exactly be like you. And there's a program that's being started called the mentoring program, and I volunteered for it. We used to have it when I was at Morgan Stanley. We had a program called One to One. And I think if you can, and I'd mentioned to Peter Henry a number of times, there's this book called Hillbilly Elegy, and I love that book, and it gives you a good idea. But that's what the importance of networking is. You know, it helps you when something goes wrong.
Yeah. Rob, and I've never sort of actively tried to build a network. I think it comes more organically, as you were talking about, through, you know, demonstrating you have some skill, some expertise. Really, there are two keys to building a good network, in my mind. One is be really good at something. Three keys. Be really good at something. Be willing to work with other people on that something. And then 3, don't be a jerk. That gets you a long ways in life. But honestly, that's one thing that sort of holds so many people down, is they're just jerks. But if you can develop a real skill, for me, I worked in the Kansas Securities Commission, out in the middle of nowhere, but I got involved in project groups through the North American Securities Administrators Association, NASA, you know, the other NASA as they're known here. And so in working in those project groups, I got to know people from around the country. Next thing you know, my phone's ringing, people asking me for advice on how to handle different situations and things like that. And I, gradually developed a reputation as one of the top blue sky lawyers in the country. Well, what is that? I mean, that's a niche if there ever was one. But, that's the, find something that you're really good at, that you're the expert in, and your network will grow. And for me, it paid off in that in 2011, change in administration in Kansas. I'm out on the street, much like you, and I get a phone call the next day basically inviting me to, well, it was from a guy at NASA saying, you know that job we talked about a couple months ago and you didn't want to move to DC? Well, what about now? And circumstances had changed, so here we came.
We could have this conversation all day long. I hope what I heard from my colleagues, and what I hope you all heard, is that they're proud of their background. They very much bring that to work every day, and that's not an easy thing to do. I understand. I think we all understand that it can be hard. Sometimes you can feel, as you were saying, a little ashamed. But bringing who you are to the process of building your career, I hope you took away that each of these colleagues have done that. And look at them now. It's not an easy conversation to have, but it's an important one to have. You don't have to let go of who you are to do the things that you need to do to build yourself as a first-generation professional. That's why I'm so proud that you all shared all these, all this with us today. I'm also very proud to be introducing the next session because it features two of my very favorite colleagues. You'll hear next from my colleague and friend, Commissioner Elad Roisman, a truly extraordinary colleague, and Lori Schock, who works on our investor education initiatives. Thank you so much to my colleagues and friends for sharing their stories, and I look forward to hearing from the next panel. Thank you.